I remember the exact moment I realized that my mother's love came with a price tag. I was 8 years old, and I had just gotten a B+ on a math test. The way she looked at me that day taught me that I wasn't her son. I was her project. My name is Jake Williams, and I'm 13 years old. Most people think I'm the luckiest kid alive because I have what everyone calls the perfect mother. Dr. Amanda Williams is a child psychologist who has written 3 best-selling books about raising successful children. She appears on morning talk shows, speaks at conferences, and other parents always tell me how fortunate I am to have someone so dedicated to my success. What they don't see is the terror that lives inside me every single day. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a house that looks like it belongs in a magazine. Everything is white and clean and organized. There are no toys scattered around, no evidence that a 13-year-old lives here. My mother says clutter interferes with optimal brain function, so everything has its place, and I better make sure it stays there. This morning started like every other morning. My alarm went off at exactly 6 a.m. Not because I said it, but because my mother determined that this is the optimal wake-up time for someone with my cognitive profile. Itonim, I have exactly 1 hour to shower, dress in the clothes she picked out, eat the breakfast she prepared, and review my daily goals. "Good morning, Jake," she said when I walked into the kitchen. She was already dressed in her business suit, checking something on her tablet. "How did you sleep? Any dreams I should know about?" I have to write down my dreams every night in a journal she reviews. She says it helps her monitor my psychological development. "I slept fine, Mom. I dreamed about the science project. It was a lie. I actually dreamed about running away, but I learned long ago to tell her what she wants to hear." She made a note on her tablet. "Excellent. That shows healthy cognitive processing. Now, let's review today's schedule." She pulled out her planning book where every minute of my life is mapped out. "You have advanced math tutoring after school, then violin practice, then Mandarin lesson. I've also scheduled a session with Dr. Peterson to discuss your social adjustment patterns. Dr. Peterson is my therapist, except he's not really there to help me. He's there to document how well my mother's methods are working. Every week I sit in his office and tell him how grateful I am for my educational opportunities and how much I love learning. If I said anything else, my mother would know, and the consequences would be terrible. I've also arranged a meeting with your principal about advancing you to 9th grade, she continued. Your current academic environment is clearly insufficient. The thought of being moved up another grade made my stomach hurt. I'm already the youngest kid in my class by 2 years. I have no friends because my mother says other kids my age are intellectually beneath me and would drag down my potential. Moving up would make me even more alone, but I couldn't tell her that. Expressing reluctance about academic advancement is forbidden in our house. "That sounds great, Mom. Thank you for advocating for my education." She smiled and made another note. Perfect answer. After breakfast, she walked me through our daily ritual. She straightened my collar, checked my backpack, everything had to be organized exactly the way she wanted, and looked me in the eyes with that intense stare that made my skin crawl. "Remember, Jake, you represent our family everywhere you go. Every choice you make reflects on everything I've taught you. Don't disappoint me." The weight of those words crushed down on my shoulders. I wasn't just a kid going to school. I was proof that her parenting methods worked. I was her walking advertisement. At Phoenix Prep Academy, I was known as the perfect student. Straight A's, perfect behavior, never any trouble. Teachers loved me because I made them look good. But other kids looked at me like I was some kind of robot. And they weren't wrong. I had been programmed so thoroughly that I had forgotten how to be human. During lunch, while other kids played or hung out, I sat in the library working on extra assignments. My mother had trained me to feel guilty whenever I wasn't actively learning something. She called free time wasted potential. That's when Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor, came over to my table. "Jake," she said, sitting down across from me, "I've noticed you spend every lunch break in here. Don't you ever want to hang out with the other kids?" The question caught me off guard. Want? I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked me what I wanted. "I prefer educational activities to recreational ones," I said automatically. "My mother says academic excellence requires sacrifice." Mrs. Rodriguez looked sad when I said that. "What do you do for fun, Jake? What makes you happy?" fun, happiness. These weren't concepts that existed in my mother's world. Everything was about achievement, optimization, reaching my maximum potential. I enjoy learning, I said, because it was the only safe answer. But what about just being a kid sometimes? What about playing or relaxing? I didn't know how to answer that. I had never been allowed to be a kid. From the moment I could walk and talk, I had been expected to behave like a miniature adult. I think academic achievement is more important than play, I said, repeating my mother's words. Mrs. Rodriguez looked even sadder. She asked me a few more questions, but I gave her the same programmed responses my mother had trained me to give. That afternoon, I had my session with Dr. Peterson. His office was beige and boring, with diplomas covering the walls. "How are things at home, Jake?" he asked, like he did every week. "Everything is great. My mother is very supportive of my development. I appreciate everything she does to help me succeed." He made notes while I talked. Another successful session where I proved what a well-adjusted kid I was. When I got home, my mother was waiting with her daily questionnaire. She wanted to know about every conversation I'd had, every interaction with teachers or students. "Tell me about your conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez," she said. My stomach dropped. How did she know? She asked about my lunch activities. I explained that I prefer intellectual pursuits. Good. It's important that you maintain appropriate boundaries with school personnel who might not understand your unique needs. That night, lying in bed, I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's question. What made me happy? I tried to remember a time when I had felt genuine joy instead of just the relief of meeting my mother's expectations. I couldn't remember any. For 13 years, I had been my mother's greatest experiment. I was living proof that her theories worked. But somewhere in the process of becoming perfect, I had stopped being myself. I wondered if there was anything left of the real Jake Williams underneath all the programming, or if my mother had succeeded in creating exactly what she wanted. A brilliant, accomplished shell of a human being who existed only to prove her methods worked. As I fell asleep, I wished someone would see past my perfect performance and recognize the scared, lonely kid underneath. Someone who would care enough to ask the right questions and brave enough to listen to the answers I was too terrified to give. But wishes were just another form of unproductive thinking that my mother had trained me to suppress. So I buried the wish deep inside, along with everything else that didn't fit her vision of who I was supposed to be. Tomorrow would be another day of being perfect. Another day of slowly disappearing into someone else's dream of success. Another day of dying a little more inside while everyone applauded my achievement. In 20 years of working with children, I had developed what I called my gut instinct for kids in trouble. Jake Williams set off every alarm bell I had, and he did it while maintaining perfect grades and flawless behavior. My name is Carmen Rodriguez, and I've been a school counselor for 20 years. In that time, I've seen every kind of family crisis imaginable: abuse, neglect, divorce, trauma. I've learned to spot the warning signs, to read between the lines, to see past the stories children tell to protect the adults who are hurting them. But I had never encountered a case quite like Jake Williams. On the surface, Jake appeared to be every educator's dream: perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect manners. His mother, Dr. Amanda Williams, was involved in his education to a degree that most teachers could only dream of. She attended every conference, volunteered for every committee, and maintained constant communication about Jake's academic progress. But something about their relationship bothered me in ways I couldn't initially explain. The first red flag was Jake's behavior during unstructured time. While other 13-year-olds used lunch and recess to socialize or decompress, Jake spent every free moment in the library working on advanced assignments. When I asked him about it, his responses sounded rehearsed. "I prefer educational activities to recreational ones," he had told me, using language no 13-year-old would naturally choose. The second red flag was his reaction whenever his mother was mentioned. During our brief conversations, Jake was relatively relaxed, still formal and overly mature, but I occasionally caught glimpses of a normal kid underneath. But the moment Dr. Williams' name came up, his entire demeanor would shift. His shoulders would tense, his responses would become robotic, and his eyes would take on a hypervigilant quality that I had learned to associate with children who were afraid. I had first met Dr. Amanda Williams 6 months ago when she requested a meeting about Jake's educational optimization. She was an imposing woman, tall, perfectly dressed, with the kind of commanding presence that made people automatically defer to her authority. Her credentials were impressive: PhD in psychology, best-selling books, regular TV appearances as a parenting expert. "Jake is profoundly gifted," she had told me, producing a folder thick with test scores and evaluations. "His IQ is in the top 1%. His emotional maturity is equally advanced. I need to ensure this school is providing appropriate intellectual stimulation." During that meeting, I had watched Jake sit perfectly still in the corner while his mother discussed his future as if he weren't there. He never spoke, unless directly addressed, never expressed opinions, never showed any sign of having preferences independent of his mother's vision. "Jake, what do you think about possibly skipping another grade?" I had asked. He looked at his mother before answering, a quick glance, seeking permission. When she nodded slightly, he delivered a response that sounded memorized. "I'm grateful for any educational opportunities that will help me reach my potential. My mother knows what's best for my development. No 13-year-old talks about reaching their potential unless they've been extensively coached." Over the following weeks, I observed Jake more closely. He moved through the school day like he was performing a choreographed routine, hitting all the right marks, saying all the right things, maintaining perfect behavior. But there was something hollow about it, like a beautifully crafted mannequin, rather than a living child. I also noticed his interactions with other students. Jake had no real friends. He was polite, but maintained careful distance. When other kids tried to include him, he would decline with responses that sounded like they came from an etiquette manual. "Thank you for the invitation, but I need to focus on my academic responsibilities," I heard him tell a classmate who had asked him to join a pickup basketball game. I decided to research Dr. Williams and her parenting philosophy. What I found was both impressive and troubling. She had built her career on scientific parenting, optimizing children for success through systematic application of psychological principles. Her book, Raising the Exceptional Child, outlined methods for raising children who would achieve maximum potential through behavioral modification and environmental control. Reading it, I began to understand what I was seeing in Jake. He wasn't just a gifted child, he was a product, carefully engineered according to his mother's theories. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking Jake direct questions that would trigger his programmed responses, I used art therapy technique. I gave him drawing materials and asked him to create whatever came to mind. The results were heartbreaking. When Jake drew himself, the figure was always small and isolated. When he drew his house, it was architecturally perfect but completely empty. When I asked him to draw his family, he created an image of two figures with a vast space between them. Most telling was when I asked him to draw happiness instead of typical childhood images: friends, play, adventure. Jake drew a small figure sitting alone with books. When I asked him to explain, he said, "This is happiness because I'm being productive and my mother would be proud." The fact that he defined happiness as his mother's approval rather than his own emotional state was deeply concerning. I also documented Jake's physical responses during our conversation. When we talked about school or academics, he was relatively calm. But when our conversations touched on his feelings or home life, I noticed signs of stress: rapid breathing, tense shoulders, glances toward the door like he was planning escape routes. These were classic signs of a child under chronic psychological pressure. The breakthrough came when I asked Jake about his dreams for the future. Most kids his age talk about careers that interest them, places they want to visit, things they want to experience. Jake gave me a detailed recitation of his planned academic trajectory: specific universities, degree programs, career paths his mother had selected. "That sounds impressive," I said carefully. "But what do you want to do? What would make you personally happy?" Jake looked confused, as if I had spoken a foreign language. "I want to achieve the goals my mother has set for my development," he said slowly. "But what about your own goals? Your own dreams?" The confusion deepened. For a moment I saw a crack in his perfect facade. A lost, frightened child who had been so programmed that he couldn't distinguish between his mother's expectations and his own desires. "I don't understand the question," he whispered. and I realized with horror that he was telling the truth. He literally didn't understand the concept of having personal autonomy because it had been systematically eliminated. That night, I reviewed everything I knew about Jake's case. The pattern was clear. Dr. Williams had weaponized child development, using sophisticated psychological techniques to create a child who existed solely to validate her theories. She had isolated him from normal relationships, convinced him his natural impulses were character flaws, and conditioned him to find value only through meeting her expectations. She had taken a healthy child and transformed him into a high-functioning robot, and the most insidious part was that it looked like success. Jake's achievements were real, his behavior was exemplary, and his mother's devotion was obvious. To casual observers, this appeared to be an ideal family. But I could see what others missed. Jake wasn't thriving, he was surviving. He was disappearing into someone else's vision of excellence. I knew I had to act. Jake needed someone to advocate for him, to see past his perfect performance and recognize the child underneath who was slowly dying inside. The next morning, I called the Arizona Department of Child Safety. "I need to report suspected psychological abuse," I told the intake worker. "Can you describe the nature of the abuse?" And that's when I realized how difficult this would be. How do you explain that a child is being destroyed by success? How do you describe abuse that looks like devotion? "It's complicated," I said, and began to explain about Jake Williams and his perfect, terrifying mother. I described a child who had been systematically conditioned to suppress his identity, to view his emotions as obstacles, to find worth only in meeting impossible standards. I explained how sophisticated psychological techniques were being used to create a performing robot rather than nurture a human child. The worker listened patiently, but I could hear the skepticism. Without physical signs of abuse or obvious neglect, cases like this were extremely difficult to substantiate. "I'll file your report," she said finally, "but I want to manage expectations. Psychological abuse cases are hard to prove, especially when the child appears successful." After hanging up, I knew my report might disappear into a system designed for more obvious abuse. But I couldn't give up on Jake. I decided to continue documenting everything, watching for opportunities to connect with him, letting him know someone saw him as more than his achievement. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is witness a child's struggle and refuse to look away, even when everyone else is applauding the performance that's slowly destroying them. Even when the person hurting them has convinced the world they're saving them. Even when the cage is so beautiful, people mistake it for freedom. The moment I walked into that house, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. It was too perfect, too controlled, too sterile. It looked like a museum exhibit about childhood rather than a place where a child actually lived. Detective Lisa Chen had been investigating child welfare cases for 12 years, but the report that landed on her desk about Jake Williams was unlike anything she had encountered. The allegation was psychological abuse. A 13-year-old boy whose academic success allegedly masked systematic emotional manipulation by his psychologist mother. On paper, it seemed like a non-case. Jake Williams showed no signs of physical abuse, lived in obvious comfort, and was academically exceptional. His mother, Dr. Amanda Williams, was a respected professional with impressive credentials. Most investigators would have closed the file after a preliminary review. But Carmen Rodriguez's documentation was compelling. The behavioral observations concerning artwork and recorded conversations painted a picture of a child who had been psychologically conditioned to the point of losing his own identity. Lisa decided to conduct a home visit under the guise of a routine welfare check. The Williams house in Scottsdale was architecturally stunning, a modern masterpiece of glass and steel that screamed wealth and success. But as Lisa approached the front door, something felt off. The landscape was too perfect, too sterile. There were no bikes in the driveway, no sports equipment, no signs that a teenager lived here. Dr. Amanda Williams answered the door with a practiced smile. She was perfectly dressed despite it being Saturday morning, her blonde hair styled, her makeup flawless. Everything about her projected control and authority. "Detective Chen, I presume? Please come in. I've prepared some information that should clear up any misunderstandings." The interior was even more unsettling than the exterior. Every surface was spotless, every object precisely placed. It looked like a design magazine photo rather than a home where a child lived. There were no video games, no clutter, no evidence of normal teenage life. "Where is Jake?" Lisa asked. "He's in his study room completing weekend assignments. I thought we should speak privately first so you could understand the context of his exceptional development." Already, Dr. Williams was controlling the narrative, positioning herself as the expert who would provide context for any observations Lisa might make. "I'd like to speak with Jake first. That's standard procedure." "Oh, of course, but please keep in mind that Jake is highly sensitive. Unexpected questions from strangers can be disruptive to his psychological equilibrium." She was already planting seeds, portraying Jake as fragile, someone who needed protection from outside interference. Jake's study room was a converted bedroom that looked more like a corporate office than a teenager's space. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with advanced academic texts. A large desk dominated the center, covered with organized supplies and what appeared to be college-level coursework. Jake was sitting at the desk, working in a calculus textbook. He looked up when Lisa entered, and she was struck by how adult his expression was. Controlled, wary, completely lacking the natural curiosity most kids showed when meeting police officers. "Hello, Jake. I'm Detective Chen. I work with Child Protective Services, and I wanted to ask you a few questions." "Good morning, Detective Chen," Jake replied formally. "My mother explained that you might have questions about my educational development." The phrasing was wrong. No 13-year-old would naturally describe a CPS visit as being about educational development. He had been coached. "Actually, I'm here to talk about you, how you're feeling, what you enjoy, what your daily life is like." Jake glanced toward the door, anxiety flickering across his face. "I'm very grateful for the educational opportunities my mother provides. I enjoy learning and working toward academic excellence." "What do you do for fun, Jake?" The question seemed to confuse him. He sat silent for several seconds, clearly struggling. "Fun is," he started, then stopped. "I enjoy achieving learning objectives. When I master new concepts, that creates positive emotional responses." Lisa felt a chill. This 13-year-old was describing his emotions in clinical terms, like he was a case study rather than a child. What about friends? What about hanging out, playing games, just being a kid? Jake's breathing became more rapid. "Social activities are incorporated into my development schedule when they serve educational purposes. My mother explains that unstructured socializing can interfere with optimal cognitive growth." Lisa spent 30 minutes with Jake, asking about his routine, his relationships, his feelings. Every answer was carefully constructed, emotionally detached, devoid of spontaneity. It was like interviewing a sophisticated computer program rather than a teenage boy. When she asked about his future plans, Jake recited a detailed academic trajectory including specific universities and career paths. When she asked what would make him happy, he looked genuinely puzzled and said he wanted to maximize his developmental potential. After finishing with Jake, Lisa met with Dr. Williams in her home office. The walls were covered with diplomas, awards, and book covers, a carefully curated display designed to intimidate. "Dr. Williams, I have concerns about Jake's emotional development." "What concerns?" Dr. Williams asked, her tone defensive. "He seems unable to express personal preferences or emotions. He has no age-appropriate social relationships. He appears to be under constant psychological pressure to maintain impossible standards." Dr. Williams's response was immediate and rehearsed. "Detective Chen, Jake is a profoundly gifted child with exceptional emotional regulation. What you're interpreting as problems are actually signs of advanced development." She produced a thick folder of documentation, test scores, psychological evaluations, academic achievements. "I have assessments from multiple professionals confirming Jake's exceptional abilities. His intellectual functioning is in the top 1%. His emotional maturity is equally advanced." The documentation was impressive but strategically selected. Lisa noticed that all evaluators had been chosen by Dr. Williams, and the assessments focused on academic performance rather than emotional well-being. "Dr. Williams, can you describe Jake's daily routine?" For 20 minutes, Dr. Williams outlined a schedule that was regimented to the minute. Jake woke at 6 a.m., followed structured morning routines, attended school, participated in educational activities, completed homework plus additional assignments, and went to bed at 9 p.m. Every moment was accounted for. When does Jake get free time? When does he get to just be a teenager? Dr. Williams looked at her like she had asked something incomprehensible. Detective Chen, childhood isn't about indulgence. It's about preparation. Every moment is precious. Allowing unproductive activities is actually neglect of a child's potential. What about friendships? What about social development? Jake interacts with peers during structured activities. However, most children his age are developmentally behind him, so extensive socialization would be counterproductive. Lisa realized she was looking at someone who had intellectualized parenting to the point of losing sight of childhood as a natural developmental stage. Dr. Williams viewed Jake not as a person, but as a project to be optimized. What happens if Jake doesn't meet your expectations? What if he wants to pursue interests that don't align with your plans? For the first time, Dr. Williams looked uncomfortable. Jake doesn't have those types of counterproductive impulses because he understands the importance of long-term thinking over immediate gratification. But what if he did? What if he wanted to quit violin and play sports instead? Those types of choices would indicate that he needs additional guidance in understanding optimal decision-making. Lisa spent another hour documenting Dr. Williams's philosophy and methods. What emerged was a picture of systematic psychological control, disguised as scientific parenting. Jake's preferences, emotions, and identity were all subject to his mother's approval and modification. When Lisa left the Williams house, she was convinced that Carmen Rodriguez's concerns were valid. Jake was being subjected to sophisticated psychological abuse that was destroying his capacity for autonomous thought and emotional expression. But proving it would be extraordinarily difficult. Dr. Williams had credentials, documentation, and expert opinions supporting her methods. She could frame any intervention as interference with innovative parenting that was producing results. Lisa decided to request a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Jake by an independent expert, someone who specialized in recognizing subtle forms of emotional abuse. 2 weeks later, Dr. Michael Santos was appointed to evaluate Jake. Dr. Santos was one of the few psychologists in Arizona trained to recognize sophisticated psychological manipulation in family systems. The evaluation took place over 6 sessions at a neutral location. Dr. Santos used standardized tests, projective assessment, and clinical interviews to understand Jake's psychological functioning. What he discovered was devastating. Jake's intellectual abilities were indeed exceptional, but his emotional and social development had been severely compromised. When asked to make 3 wishes, Jake couldn't engage in fantasy without seeking the correct answer. When shown ambiguous images and asked to create stories, his narratives were always about achievement and meeting expectations. Most telling was his response to questions about personal autonomy. Jake literally couldn't understand concepts like personal preference or individual choice. He had been so thoroughly conditioned that these basic psychological functions had been suppressed. This child shows clear signs of what we call developmental identity suppression, Dr. Santos wrote in his report. His natural personality and preferences have been systematically erased and replaced with externally imposed goals. While his academic achievements are real, they come at the cost of his psychological well-being. Dr. Santos recommended immediate intervention to protect Jake's psychological development and help him begin discovering his own identity. The custody hearing that followed was unprecedented. Dr. Williams's legal team presented her as a dedicated mother whose only crime was being too successful at raising an exceptional child. They brought expert witnesses who testified about gifted children's needs and the dangers of pathologizing achievement. But the prosecution presented Dr. Santos's evaluation and expert testimony about psychological abuse. They argued that Jake's apparent success was actually evidence of systematic conditioning that was destroying his autonomy. The most powerful moment came when Jake himself was asked to testify. Now 14 and having spent 3 months in therapeutic foster care, he was beginning to develop his own voice. "I thought I was happy," he told the court, "but I realize now that I didn't know what happiness was supposed to feel like. I thought it meant never disappointing my mother, never having my own opinion, never being anything except what she wanted me to be." The judge's decision was clear. While Dr. Williams's professional expertise is acknowledged, her methods have created an environment where Jake cannot develop psychological autonomy or emotional independence. The court finds that continued exposure poses significant risk to his psychological health. Dr. Williams's parental rights were terminated, and Jake was placed permanently with the foster family where he had begun to discover who he really was. 6 months later, Jake was a different child. He had joined the soccer team, made friends, and was learning to pursue interests simply because they brought him joy. He still struggled with perfectionism and anxiety, but he was developing his own opinions, preferences, and identity. The most amazing thing, his foster mother said, is watching him make mistakes now and laugh about it instead of having a panic attack. Watching him be a normal, imperfect teenager. Jake's story became a landmark case in recognizing psychological abuse. It demonstrated that children could be damaged by success just as much as by failure, that love without autonomy was control, and that the most beautiful cages were often the hardest to escape. Today, Jake is thriving not because he's perfect, but because he's finally free to be himself, messy, imperfect, and beautifully human. Recovery from psychological conditioning isn't just about learning what you want, it's about learning that you're allowed to want anything at all. It's about discovering that your worth isn't based on performance, and that being yourself is not just acceptable, but necessary. Jake Williams sat in Dr. Elena Vasquez's office, fidgeting with a stress ball and looking nothing like the perfectly composed child who had been removed from his mother's custody 6 months earlier. His hair was slightly messy, his clothes were wrinkled from actually playing during recess, and for the first time in his life, he looked like a normal 14-year-old. "How was school today?" Dr. Vasquez asked, settling into her chair across from him. "Good, I guess," Jake said, then immediately looked worried. "I mean, it was productive. I learned things. My performance was—" "Jake," Dr. Vasquez interrupted gently, "remember what we talked about. You don't have to evaluate every experience. It's okay to just say it was good or bad or boring. How did it feel?" Jake took a deep breath, still struggling with the concept that his feelings mattered more than his performance. "It felt fun," he said finally, the words still sounding foreign in his mouth. "We played dodgeball in PE, and I actually laughed when I got hit instead of analyzing my reflexes and reaction time." Dr. Vasquez smiled. These small victories were huge for a child who had spent 13 years being systematically conditioned to suppress every natural impulse and emotion. Jake was living with David and Maria Rodriguez, therapeutic foster parents who specialized in children recovering from psychological abuse. The transition had been difficult for everyone involved. "He didn't know how to play," Maria had told Dr. Vasquez during their first meeting. "When we gave him board games, he would try to study the rules like they were academic material. When we suggested watching TV, he asked what educational objectives the program was designed to achieve." The first few weeks had been particularly challenging. Jake was simultaneously relieved to be away from his mother's impossible expectations and terrified by the lack of structure and performance metrics. He didn't know how to exist without constant evaluation and feedback. "What am I supposed to do?" he had asked Maria during his first week. "What are my goals? How will I know if I'm succeeding?" "You're supposed to be a kid," Maria had told him. "You're supposed to figure out what you like, what makes you happy, what you want to do with your free time." The concept was so foreign to Jake that it took weeks before he began to understand that he was allowed to have preferences that weren't tied to achievement or external validation. Dr. Vasquez had been working with Jake twice a week, using specialized techniques designed to help children recover from psychological conditioning. The process was delicate. Too much too fast could overwhelm him, but too little would leave him trapped in old patterns. "Today I want to try something different," Dr. Vasquez said, pulling out art supplies. "I want you to draw or create anything you want. No rules, no objectives, no evaluation criteria. Just make something that feels good to you." Jake stared at the supplies with confusion and anxiety. "But what should I make? What's the purpose? How will you assess?" "Jake, there is no purpose except whatever purpose you give it. There's no assessment except whether you enjoyed the process." It took 20 minutes of encouragement before Jake tentatively picked up a crayon. His first attempts were technically perfect, precise geometric shapes, realistic drawings with careful attention to proportion and detail. But gradually, as Dr. Vasquez consistently emphasized that there were no wrong choices, something shifted. Jake began experimenting with color combinations that had no basis in reality. He drew fantastical creatures that couldn't exist in nature. He created abstract patterns that served no educational purpose whatsoever. And for brief moments, Dr. Vasquez saw glimpses of the creative, imaginative child who had been buried under years of optimization and control. "I like making the dragon breathe rainbow fire," Jake admitted quietly after completing a wild, impossible creature. "I know it's not scientifically accurate, but it looks cool." "Yes? What do you think about it being not scientifically accurate?" "My mother would have said it shows fuzzy thinking and lack of attention to detail," Jake said, his voice taking on the clinical tone he still slipped into when quoting his mother's teachings. "But I don't care. I like it anyway." Jake had been enrolled at Lincoln Middle School, a regular public school where he could interact with peers his actual age without the pressure of academic acceleration. The transition was difficult on multiple levels. Academically, Jake was far ahead of his classmates, but his new support team had decided that social and emotional development were more important than academic advancement. For the first time in his life, Jake was in classes where he wasn't the youngest, smallest, most isolated student. "The other kids think I'm weird," Jake told Dr. Vasquez during one session. "They asked me to hang out at the mall after school, and I asked them what educational activities they had planned. They just stared at me. How did that make you feel?" "Embarrassed? Confused. I wanted to hang out with them, but I didn't know how. I've never just hung out with anyone." Dr. Vasquez worked with Jake on basic social skills that most children develop naturally through unstructured play and peer interaction. He had to learn how to engage in casual conversation, how to express preferences in group settings, how to handle the give and take of normal friendships. The process was often frustrating for Jake, who was accustomed to excelling at everything immediately. Making friends required vulnerability, authenticity, and acceptance of imperfection. All things that had been systematically trained out of him. But slowly, he began to connect with other students. He discovered that some kids actually thought his intelligence was cool rather than intimidating. He learned that people could like him for his personality rather than his achievement. David and Maria Rodriguez had fostered dozens of children over the years, but Jake presented unique challenges. Most of their previous placements had come from backgrounds of obvious abuse or neglect. Jake had been psychologically damaged by what looked like perfect parenting. "The hardest part," David explained to Dr. Vasquez, "is that he still loves his mother. He knows intellectually that what she did was harmful, but emotionally he misses the structure, the clear expectations, the sense of being special and important." Jake struggled with complex feelings about his mother. He was angry about what she had done to him, but he also felt guilty about betraying her by speaking out. He missed the certainty of always knowing exactly what was expected of him, even as he appreciated his newfound freedom. "Sometimes I dream about going back," Jake admitted during therapy. "Not because I want to live that way again, but because it was easier when someone else made all the decisions for me." "That's normal," Dr. Vasquez assured him. "Freedom can be scary when you've never had it before. Learning to make your own choices is a skill that takes practice." The Rodriguez family worked hard to provide Jake with choices in everyday situations: what to eat for breakfast, what clothes to wear, how to spend his free time. These seemed like small decisions, but for Jake, they represented monumental steps toward autonomy. Perhaps the most profound part of Jake's recovery was discovering who he was when he wasn't performing for someone else's approval. For 13 years, his identity had been entirely constructed around his mother's expectations. Now he had to figure out his own preferences, interests, and personality. He discovered that he actually enjoyed art more than advanced mathematics. He found that he preferred casual clothes to the formal outfits his mother had always selected. He learned that he was naturally funny and social when he wasn't being monitored and evaluated. "I tried out for the school play," Jake announced during one therapy session, grinning with excitement that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "How does that feel?" Dr. Vasquez asked. "Terrifying and amazing. I've never done anything just because I wanted to before. My mother would have said acting was frivolous and wouldn't contribute to my academic portfolio. But what do you think? I think it's fun. I like pretending to be someone else. I like making people laugh. I don't care if it's not productive or educational. I like it. This was a breakthrough moment. Jake was not only expressing a personal preference, but actively choosing to pursue something his mother would have disapproved of. He was developing the capacity to value his own enjoyment over external approval. Dr. Amanda Williams had not accepted the loss of custody quietly. She hired expensive lawyers and fought the decision, arguing that removing Jake from her care was actually harming his development. She maintained that her methods were scientifically sound, and that Jake's academic potential was being wasted in his current placement. The media attention around the case was intense. Dr. Williams appeared on television defending her parenting method, painting herself as a devoted mother, whose only crime was caring too much about her son's success. She had supporters who argued that the state had no right to interfere with innovative parenting techniques that produced results. But child development experts who testified in the case painted a different picture. They explained that Jake's apparent success had come at the cost of his psychological well-being, that academic achievement without emotional autonomy was ultimately destructive. You can train a child to perform at exceptional levels, testified Dr. Sarah Morrison, a specialist in childhood development. But if that training comes at the cost of their ability to think independently, form relationships, and develop their own identity, then you haven't created a successful child. You've created a highly functioning prisoner. The case became a landmark in recognizing psychological abuse. It established precedent for protecting children not just from physical harm, but from systematic psychological manipulation that destroyed their capacity for autonomous development. Dr. Williams eventually lost all appeals and was prohibited from having any contact with Jake. She continued to practice psychology but was required to undergo supervision and additional training in appropriate therapeutic boundaries. Jake Williams Rodriguez is now 16 years old, having been legally adopted by his foster family. He bears little resemblance to the perfectly controlled child who was removed from his mother's custody 2 years earlier. He's an honor student, but not because he's been programmed to achieve, because he's discovered that he genuinely enjoys learning when it's his choice. He's also involved in theater, plays guitar in a band with friends, and volunteers at an animal shelter on weekends. Most importantly, he's learned to fail at things without having panic attacks. He's learned to disagree with adults without fear of punishment. He's learned to pursue interests simply because they bring him joy, not because they serve some larger developmental objective. People ask me if I'm angry at my mother, Jake said during a recent interview. The answer is complicated. I'm angry about what she did to me, about the childhood she stole, about the way she made me believe I was only valuable if I was perfect. But I also feel sorry for her because I don't think she understood the difference between loving someone and controlling them. Jake still attends therapy, working through the ongoing effects of his early conditioning. He sometimes struggles with perfectionist tendencies and occasionally reverts to seeking external validation. But he's developed tools for recognizing these patterns and choosing different responses. The biggest thing I've learned, he reflected, is that you're allowed to want things for yourself. You're allowed to have opinions that are different from your parents. You're allowed to fail, to be imperfect, to be yourself. And if the people who are supposed to love you can't accept that, then the problem isn't with you. Jake's case led to significant changes in how educational and child welfare systems recognize psychological abuse. Schools now receive training on identifying children who may be suffering from achievement pressure abuse, systematic psychological manipulation disguised as high academic expectations. Carmen Rodriguez, the school counselor whose concerns initiated the investigation, became a national advocate for recognizing subtle forms of child abuse. She speaks at conferences about the importance of looking beyond academic achievement to assess children's overall well-being. We need to remember that the goal of childhood isn't to create perfect students or perfect achievement, she says. It's to help children develop into healthy, autonomous adults who can think for themselves, form genuine relationships, and find meaning in their own lives. Dr. Amanda Williams continues to practice psychology and maintains that her methods were misunderstood. She has never publicly acknowledged the psychological damage her pursuit of perfection caused her son, instead positioning herself as a victim of an overzealous child welfare system. But Jake has moved beyond needing her acknowledgement. He's discovered something his mother never understood, that the goal of growing up isn't to become perfect, it's to become yourself. Jake's story serves as both a warning and a source of hope. It demonstrates that abuse doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it comes disguised as love, expertise, and dedication to a child's success. It shows that children can be damaged by impossible expectations just as much as by neglect or violence. But it also shows the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Children who have been systematically conditioned can learn to think for themselves. Kids who have been taught that their worth depends on their achievements can discover that they're valuable simply for being who they are. Jake learned that he was more than his test scores, more than his mother's expectation, more than anyone else's vision of who he should be. He learned that being imperfect wasn't a character flaw, it was part of being human. And perhaps most importantly, he learned that real love doesn't require you to be perfect. It accepts you as you are, while supporting you to become who you want to be. Today, Jake Williams Rodriguez is a typical teenager with typical problems, worrying about college application, stressing about social situation, arguing with his parents about curfews. And those typical problems represent an extraordinary victory, because sometimes the most profound success isn't achieving perfection. It's gaining the freedom to be beautifully, authentically, imperfectly yourself. The boy who once couldn't answer, "What makes you happy?" now has a long list of things he enjoys, dreams he's pursuing, and plans he's making for a future he gets to design himself. And that transformation from perfect prisoner to imperfect person represents the most meaningful achievement of all, the rescue of a child's right to exist as an individual, rather than someone else's idea of optimal human performance. Jake's journey from psychological captivity to authentic freedom proves that it's never too late to discover who you really are when you're finally allowed to make that choice for yourself.